Welcome, everyone, and thank you for tuning into In Dialogue through Jay DeFeo's lens. My name is Natalie Dupêcher, and I am the Assistant Curator of Modern Art at the Menil Collection. Many thanks to DeCamera for providing the introductory music we were just listening to. That was an excerpt of Jeff Scott's Passion for Bach and Coltrane from a live recording performed by the Imani Winds and Harlem Quartet with Alex Brown piano, Zach Brown bass, Neil Smith drums, and A.B. Spellman poet and narration. And as a reminder to our viewers, please continue to submit your questions throughout the program by emailing them to programs@menil.org, and we will do our best to get to them. I'm very happy to be joined online tonight by Leah Levy. Hi, Leah.
Hi.
Leah is the Executive Director of the Jay DeFeo Foundation, and we'll be discussing the photo-based work of Jay DeFeo tonight, and there is truly no one better to have this conversation with than Leah. Before we begin, I would like to play a short walkthrough of my exhibition, Photography and the Surreal Imagination, which features 3 photo collages by DeFeo that we'll start the conversation off with on the other side. This is an exhibition that explores the tension in photography between truth and fiction, and how that tension really surfaced and became generative during and after the Surrealist movement. We're heading here into the first gallery that highlights artists' exploration of the body. This is a large photo montage by Max Ernst from the early 1920s from our collection. And in addition to works from that time period, though, the exhibition includes post-war artists like Cindy Sherman, who you're seeing here, as well as Francesca Woodman, whose photographs of herself, much like Sherman's, explore questions of selfhood, femininity. We're moving now into the second gallery that looks at manipulations of the image itself, both in the darkroom with Man Ray's photograms here and out. So here are the 3 collages by DeFeo that we'll start off with. And certainly collage is one of those techniques or strategies that artists have continued to really work with. You're seeing here some works by Lorna Simpson that were made just a couple years ago. And you can imagine how this idea of taking apart the world and reconstituting it with the fragments become really powerful in her hands and in those of others in the exhibition. And finally, in the third gallery, we are looking at the transformation of the everyday in photography. So they're straight photographs, but that sort of hinge on the undercurrent of strangeness in everyday life. These are works by Allison Janae Hamilton. And then on the total other end of the spectrum, some works by Eugene Atget from the early 1900s, which were very inspirational to a number of surrealists. And finally, a work by Rose Mandel. She made this in the 1950s in San Francisco and was, in fact, a friend of Jay DeFeo's, which sort of brings us back to her. A special thank you as well to the show's wonderful lenders and sponsors, as well as to our videographers tonight, Zainab and Matthew, both of whom you saw briefly in that clip. So now we'll turn to Jay DeFeo with a kind of brief biographical introduction for those who may not be as familiar with her work. Jay DeFeo was a really pivotal figure in the California Bay arts community from the mid-1950s until her death in 1989. And as we'll see tonight, she really experimented with unorthodox media techniques, often working between and mixing media, creating a really varied, poetic, imaginative body of work. It's hard to talk about DeFeo without at least mentioning the rose, this which you see here on the screen. The Rose is a monumental painting that DeFeo famously devoted 8 years of her life to creating. She made it between 1958 and 66. The curator of a retrospective of her work in 2013, Dana Miller, wrote that DeFeo made work that can be measured in inches and in feet, in ounces and in tons. And this work is like the feet and the tons. It is 11 feet tall, about a foot thick, weighs close to a ton. And for those who are joining us from New York, it is going to be on view at the Whitney when that museum reopens. But now we'll turn to the collages in the exhibition. So here's the installation view again. These are 3 works that DeFeo made in 73. And we'll just take this first one here as a point of starting. Can you tell us, Leah, sort of what we're looking at, how these collages were made?
DeFeo talked about responding and looking at things in her immediate environment. There's the term funky that is sometimes used for the beat generation. There's also something very unpretentious, and it relates to California assemblage. What we have here is something pretty classic, a stand-up mirror with a frame. A reflection that it took us at the foundation quite a long time to figure out. It looks kind of smoky, but in reality, it really is a distorted reflection of the mirror object. And then a favored object, a broken ceramic cup handle that she loved. She photographed, and in this particular instance, she has it tipping on the edge. She's always very interested in the center and often the dark center. And so that's placed on some kind of paper or a fragment to create this still life.
And these are actually photographs, if I'm describing them correctly, Leah, that Jay took herself, developed herself, and then would cut up and recombine to create these kinds of compositions.
Exactly. There was one point at which she was very self-deprecating in many ways, and I found something where she said this was a good thing to do with bad prints. So she used what was around all the time. She also said, I have this quote from her, that she was inspired by Man Ray, that she had seen a show of his, and he more reinforced her process, but also that the law of chance seems to guide me in these little collages. And so, as she did with other work, she really welcomes how things fall.
Yeah. That's great. And then this work, that favored cup handle that you were mentioning, would go on to have quite a long sort of afterlife or continued existence in other works besides just the photo collages. I know there's also this, a number of paintings from this sort of group, but we're showing one of those called Where the Swan Flies from the Loop System group or series.
After working with that cup object in drawing and other photographs, she collaged it in other ways. In her journal, she said, I want to see what it really looks like large. And so here comes the next iteration of that in a really beautiful painting.
Yes. I mean, one of the many things that Zoom or Zoom equivalents do not allow is a sense of scale.
Right.
But just to call out that the collage we were looking at previously is a small little thing, although quite beautiful and sort of possessing in its own way. And then she moves then from that to this quite large painting that's like 5 or 6 feet tall.
Right.
So it's such a great translation.
And even larger works as well.
And then here's another one of those collages from the show. And I know that this has another kind of particular object that she was very attached to in it. Can you tell us about that?
This is kind of an eccentric pairing of a ram, and that spiral shape and form is something that we see throughout the decades in different media and in different ways. And a cutout of a candlestick telephone. We'll see it again in future images. And so she has this candlestick telephone, and there is no earpiece for it. And so as a visual pun, she takes a bulb that's in the shape of a flame, attaches it, plugs it in, and she really has a lamp, which she calls the electric telephone. Here, she's placed it on her tripod. So there's some anthropomorphic figure to it as well, I think. And you too had a next and larger life.
Yes, I'll put this up.
In this painting, Lotus Eater #1. So the form is there. As she very much likes to do, there's the additive and subtractive. So on the bottom left, that brown space is her really pulling off the paint so you see the masonite it's on. And yet above it, she's collaged this round plastic, possibly a paint lid, to add a dimensionality to it. And I also think there's something very figurative about this work as well.
Yes. And then in this last one, we see the telephone reappear, but this time sort of doubled in a sense.
Doubled, somewhat figurative. She's cut up slices of photographs, and so that line going through the entire thing is a collaged fragment of a photograph. And so there's a dialogue going on between the two telephones, and it's something else we see in Jay DeFeo's work quite often. There are families either within one work or among series of works, and this is one example of that.
I love the idea of the two telephones, like having a chat together. It makes it so, lively in a sense.
Which reminds me that these were generated by a series of telephone conversations she was having at the time with Bruce Conner. And she called him sometimes telephone. And so you're mentioning that the two telephones are having a chat is perfect.
Yes. And speaking of Bruce Conner, can you tell us about the title of these? They're all untitled, but they all share this parenthetical for BC.
It was an homage to him. They were both, according to Bruce Conner, at a moment in their careers when they needed new inspiration. And through these telephone conversations, they both made new bodies of work. They were quite separately, but inspired by that dialogue. And so she dedicated this series to him.
One of the audience questions we received in advance was, when did Jay DeFeo begin to use photography and why? And I think you've already sort of gotten towards answering part of that question about how it, in a sense, served to reinvigorate her creative practice.
Right. The key, very focused years of her photography are 1970 to 76. She had many cameras. She had a dark room. She made many hundreds of photographs, printed them, collaged them. But we have evidence of her using photography as early as the 50s. And we know she had a Polaroid camera. And we also know that she was taking photographs in her studio in very elaborate ways, and of her studio in the 70s and 80s. And in the last year of her life, she still was using photography as a way to inspire and find sources for her other works as well.
Yeah. And let's go back now to sort of the first moment you were alluding to just there, to 1958. 15 years before the works that we were just looking at, before the works that are in the show. But these are some of the first collages that she made.
She says in her journals that these are two basically unique collages, that she made them, she put a lot of energy into them, and then she moved on. But they are from cutouts from magazines, a variety of magazines. And you can see on the right references to Man Ray, and the very notion of applaud the black fact has a kind of surrealistic urge to it, I think. But it's also interesting that both of these collages on paper are then mounted on canvas, and she paints frames around them, the black on the right and the white frame on the left. And so she's mixing media here. She didn't have a strong hierarchy for media. She was incredibly fluid and very, very comfortable moving among traditional media, which is one of the reasons she's so hard to categorize.
Yeah, yeah. Well, I'm going to show here a detail of Blossom, one of those works, that really shows how sort of intricately it's pieced together. And I think also just makes the point that very differently from the later works or the 1973 works that we started with, that these are found, you know, as you were saying, materials from magazines and things that she was sort of adapting and repurposing for her own art.
Her other works also throughout the rest of her career seem to reference the body, but have more surrogates for the body. These are the most literal of references to the body that we have. Yes,
that's interesting. I mean, I'm just thinking about how in the works we were just looking at, the telephone in a number of ways is a little bit of a stand-in for a human figure, but it's of course been sort of abstracted or not abstracted, but made sort of metaphoric instead of just, you know, a sort of closer representation like we have in Blossom. And another work that she makes in 1958 that has its own sort of relationship with the camera is the eyes, which, again, just to point out the size, that's quite incredible. It's 7 feet long, but she bases this drawing, this enormous drawing, on a photograph of her own eyes, but it takes on this kind of mythical quality.
Right. I think that this really came from the literal figurative quality of the two collages that she made the same year. But she was also inspired and talks about envisioning something very major, a big statement that was to come for her. And so she references that. And there's kind of a visionary, more even than surrealistic, I think, envisioning with these, especially the paleness of the eyeballs and the sense of some kind of screen through which the eyes are looking.
And then
she maintained these amazing eyebrows for the rest of her life.
Oh, that's great. And then she does, I mean, this is the year, right, that she begins work on the rose, that she, you know, takes up so much of her life, really. And when she comes through on the other side, one of the first pieces that she makes is this work After Image, this multimedia work on paper. Can you tell us a little bit about how you understand that relationship between the eyes, the rose, and then this after image?
Yes. There was a 3-year hiatus. She really finished the rose in Pasadena in 1966, and the rose wasn't exhibited until 1968. And during those 3 years, she didn't have a studio and she didn't make much art. She called it her happening years. Once the rose was shown, it turns out she began to make art again. And she talks about this work as being really crucial. The very title, After Image, suggests what you see, what's left in your sight when you're done looking at an image. That sense of something that's radiating, the radiating line certainly relates very much to the rose, something with a center that's coming out. And then that notion of collage, of something breaking through, this always reminds me of that, because the way she tears and opens the paper was very intentional and part of it. So it's also, as we know, the shape of an eye. And you're about to show us images of how literally that is the case.
Yes. So here is, again, I mean, I'm so interested in this other sort of different, again, relationship to photography. But yes, here is the sort of source image for after image, and which is an image of a shell that she, I suppose, found in a book that was a sort of catalog of shells and their evolution.
And used this as the source for that, which she often did. But then breaks through. And it's also has a lot of different media. It has pencil, and along with the graphite, there's charcoal, there's also acrylic paint, and collage. So she's pulling everything together.
And one thing that sort of strikes me too is how it seems to me that her use of found images or sort of ready-made images is a little bit like Blossom, that collage from '58, in that it's something that she finds and makes use of, but it also is like the eyes, because instead of cutting up that found material, she uses it, like you were saying, as a sort of springboard for her imagination.
I'd also like to say that Jay wanted this work to be at the Menil. At the very end of her life, she had given this to someone, and she decided that she wanted it to be at the Menil, and we talked to the person, and he donated it to the Menil in her honor. So it's got the home it was meant to have.
Yes, that's so wonderful to know. Moving forward in time a little bit again, and as we're tracing this sort of appearance of photography and how she used it throughout her practice, one thing that sort of question becomes interesting in sort of different and complicated ways with this next work and group of works that we're going to look at. With this work is a painting called Crescent Bridge that she makes in 1970 to 72. Can you tell us about how this work sort of came to be and what its sort of peculiar source image is?
Well, it's a very particular moment. She had been working in oil paint, not only on the Rose, but in other paintings throughout the 50s. And the issue of oil paint and a support that could barely hold it was looming very large. And when she started to paint from Larkspur, she used either plywood or masonite, a very firm, solid support. And she began to use acrylic paint. She talks about it, and there are different reasons. It was cheaper. It was more accessible at the time. It was something new to experiment with. But I also think that her desire was to not use oil paint. At the same time, she worked very hard to make it do things that oil paint did. So with the Rose, she was in some ways trying to make oil paint be marble, and Crescent Bridge, acrylic then was a challenge to give it texture and depth. She loved the fact that the images and the source images of her works really transcended the definition of what the object was. So I feel slightly guilty, but will because you asked, that this is actually a very large blow up of her own dental bridge.
Yes. But it's so sort of transformed, and it becomes almost a kind of landscape abstraction. It's another sort of instance, as we were looking at earlier, of this sort of, a complete change of scale, obviously a change of medium, but also a sort of, transformation in aspect, how it becomes, it seems like a lunar landscape in a way.
Literally, she describes it as an object in space. And she is considering the lunar landscape as she paints this work.
Yeah. You mentioned earlier about her beginning now in the 1970s to take these elaborate sort of documentary shots of her studio. And we'll look at that with this picture now, where you see a part of the Crescent Bridge, that painting we were just looking at, but also after image, sort of in the corner behind some other works there.
And the Greenwich taped up on the purse. At the top, the hands that we see are actually a magazine that she used over and over again of heart surgery. And there's a radiating form going on there, a circle with the hands, some of the imagery that she finds really interesting. And for me, there's a kind of Malraux-like museum without walls. She's creating for herself and showing us, like Gretel with little crumbs, the objects she's looking at, the art historical references she's thinking about. And for me, the depth of her thought process and her referencing.
Yes, and it really becomes a kind of, like you were saying, sort of museum without walls. And it's really quite a sort of elaborate, like conceptual framing of the studio, rather than, it's in part, I think, reveals a certain interest in process and documentation, but I think, it's clearly much more than that too. Right. Not just, this is recording how my studio was on a given day, but it's a sort of intricate, array of references and thoughts and, relationships.
It's a kind of performance she's doing for herself, and making her ideas visible.
Yeah.
And recording them.
And that, again, and we were also going to just briefly show this photo collage, which is its own sort of, miniature retrospective of her work in a way.
Right. It's her own photograph of the eyes, and then a cutout of after image, the central shell, pasted within the eye, and over that, cutouts of the crescent bridge of the teeth. And so it's a collage. It's her pointing out to herself and to us the interrelationship of her vision.
Yes, and doing so, kind of poignantly and personally. I think the final work from this kind of cluster that we'll look at is this very wonderful traveling portrait, Chance Landscape. Can you talk about this title and sort of unpack it for us?
In Jay's journals, there are a couple of days where she says cut all day. The cut and the tear were actually marks for her in the same way that a brushstroke or a line might be. And then she gathered all of these cut teeth and collaged them onto a painted board with glue and acrylic. And then she put them out in the sun to dry, and they melted and found and created their own form and shape, which she happily embraced. So she also talks about her work as a dichotomy between portrait and landscape. And so these have both. So it's traveling and it's chance.
Yes. One of the questions that we got from the audience is about DeFeo's relationship with Surrealism. And I know we've talked a little bit already about, the sort of thinking about Man Ray and some of those early collages from 1958. But it seemed to me that this work was another sort of way to think about that sort of relationship with Surrealism in the sort of embrace of chance, just for starters.
Very much so. Both, it's tight relationship with Surrealism, but even more, I think, her own philosophy of a marriage between her intent and then what happens. So she's very focused on being really specific. Every mark needs to be exactly as she wants it. And then at the end of the work, she'll splatter paint on it or dig into the surface because she needs to show what's underneath. And sometimes it works and sometimes it doesn't. So there's this dichotomy in her thinking and in her art making, and a kind of extraordinary bravery. She's willing to take chances, not only to let chance happen, but to make chance, to add a kind of vitality and danger to the work process.
Yes, that's really well put. And it's, I think, a great way of, you know, sort of thinking through this traveling portrait, chance, landscape, also thinking about that dichotomy between landscape and portraiture, since this also, in a way, you know, exists between those two modalities. It sort of has a landscape form, is horizontally oriented, but it's also has sort of carries a biographical component. I mean,
and objects in space. There is a floating quality, the sense of a space around things.
I'll put this now on the screen, because another way that DeFeo used photography in this moment, as she sort of really engaged with it in the 70s, was really sort of straight photography. We've talked about her using it as a material that she would cut up and recombine in her collages. We've talked about her using photographs as a sort of source image. We've talked about it as a sort of conceptual exercise or conceptual pursuit in sort of reframing her studio practice for herself. And here we have sort of a more, you know, just like taking photographs, seeing the world through the lens.
I think that her interests in painting and in drawing are also emphasized in photography. So when I look at this photograph, I see light and dark. I see a great linearity with a lot of variation, and many of the qualities and geometric form, many of the qualities that we find in her other practices, we find in the photographs. This net she particularly liked. She had favorite things, and this was one of them. And so we find it in various ways coming out. But I think that overall sense, and yet the variation of especially texture and light and dark is emphasized here.
It seems to me that the net too, I mean, I'm just sort of thinking that the sort of rope or twine almost looks to me like an art material, like an object that she would have used to make art too.
She did.
Feature in it.
She did. There are paintings from every decade where string is a part of the work, sometimes very much so. And I also think this photograph has a lot of movement to it. There's a lot of kineticism in her work, things moving, things flowing. And I see that here too.
Yes. Another one from this same moment also in our collection at the Menil is this print of a tree, which is another one of her, a sort of recurring motif that she returns to again and again.
Same thing with mountains. She, in the early 50s, 1953, she did a really interesting series of trees that were abstracted and interpreted, not literal, but they were definitely the tree series. And we find these coming, and in these photographs that also becomes the subject. But I think here too, we see the linearity, the variation in tone, you see light, there's a lot of movement and a delicacy. So very often there's an extraordinarily delicate line in her drawing and then a splash of a brush stroke. And this reminds me of that as well. And she did a lot of photographs in the landscape, a lot of photographs in nature in the 70s.
Yes, I think when we were speaking earlier, you made the point that, in fact, photographs that, you know, look like this, photos that she took in nature, there are much more of those than these photo collages that we started the conversation with. And then the last one from this sort of group is this untitled, very dramatically lit staircase, also untitled, from 72.
The triangle. DeFeo talks a lot about simple forms, the circle, the square, the triangle, as really formative elements in her work. And so it doesn't surprise me that we see the play on that. But also there's this deep, dark shadow. She was very much attracted to blacks. And I think one of the reasons she loved photography is she could get a different kind of black. The same thing with her photocopy work. She could get a different kind of black than she could. This is really a shadow. It may be apparent. When I first saw it, I thought it was some kind of trick staircase or something, but the truth is when you're standing in front of it, you see the drama of that. It's a favorite.
Yes. One audience question we just received that I think might work in this moment is if you could speak more about Jay's relationship to color and use of color in her work. A lot of the things that we have seen so far, even the paintings, even the things that aren't photographs, are in this sort of, low key, black, white, sort of gray palette.
There are several answers to that. In the early 50s, there is an explosion of color, rich color, reds, yellows, orange, exuberant color. By the end of the 50s, her last amazing colorful work of that period is The Jewel, which is the sister, or the opposite in some ways of the rose, and filled with earth reds and browns and incredibly visceral. After the rose in the 60s and throughout the 70s, the works were very black and white, although she eschewed using the term monochromatic. That was offensive because she felt there was so much variation between black and white. In the early 80s, she once again took up color and oil paint. And we find that again. She says sometimes, she's a really fantastic colorist, but she says sometimes color's too easy. And it does things that she would rather struggle out of the more limited palette. And so we have it, and we have both large and small paintings in the 80s with lots of vibrant color, but she's still primarily attracted, I think, to this amazing variation within black, white, and whatever comes in between.
Yes, wonderful. So you were mentioning the 80s, and we're heading there now with this untitled collage from her Samurai series from 1986. Another work from the Menil's permanent holdings that I just love. And I have a few sort of close-ups that I'll put up here now that our paper conservator, Jan Barant, was kind enough to take for me a little while ago. So tell us here now too, Leah, sort of what we're looking at and how you see this fitting in with Jay's practice from over the last little while that we've discussed.
The inspiration was an exhibition of samurai helmets that she saw. She needed a starting place, whether it was metaphysical or literal, and these samurai helmets became the starting point. But that whole arranging of materials, the lines on the left that seem to be in their own rectangle is actually a cut up photocopy. Over that, there's a painted piece of paper that she's taped on under it. She's showing us, I believe, how there's rich variation but similarity with her own paint strokes. And then a push pin, not a push pin, a straight pin. That she's used both to hold something together the way you would tape, but also as an object in the way she put the lid in Lotus Eater. She's having fun. She's reaching for what's around her. And she's reminding all of us that the hierarchy of material is a kind of fallacy that is not orthodox for her. And I also think there's all of these layers in the same way in her painting that she pulls the paint back so that we can see the surface of the canvas or the masonite. Here she's adding these layers so we can understand the different stratas and the mystery of what she's doing.
And I love how in that sort of work of exposing what, you know, what she's doing and sort of showing process, that there is so much sort of material richness in this collage. There's so much tape. There's a pin. You can see several, it seems like she has repositioned the pin several times. There's a sort of bit where you can see kind of lots of holes in the paper, which I think is just really, I mean, I'm really interested in her sort of, you know, wanting to sort of show the process in that way in these collages.
Our two wonderful archivists at the foundation and I sometimes say, if it doesn't have any pinholes, it might not be a DeFeo. I mean, she was not only in the work, but she also pinned them up when she worked with them, and she wasn't precious about that.
Yeah, and she seemed to really love, like, you know, the sort of the act of working and sort of working in the artwork, if that makes sense.
Exactly.
Another audience question that we just received is about sort of a progression that we've also been, I think, tracing from the sort of total work, the total image that is the rose, and then perhaps an increasing focus on fragments or details like the eyes, the shell, the cup handle. Do you think that's a sort of fair way of kind of seeing the progression, or is that more a feature of the what we chose to focus on?
It's both. She goes from, as we've seen, very small to large. We haven't seen any of her on-like drawings, but there's a series of absolutely exquisite drawings made with a 9H pencil, so that she's never said she was restless, but I see that change, the pursuit of opposites. And so she might do a massive whole and then whole work and then focus on something very particular, the literal line, and then the chance throwing of the paint, the splash. So all of those elements, I think, come into play, including the fragment and then the whole.
Yes. I mean, it seems to me that, I mean, as you were saying, and as with so many other things, like the dichotomy between landscape and figure, between abstraction and representation, that this sort of dance between whole and fragment is another tension that structures a lot of her work throughout the years.
She was also incredibly curious. She wanted to find out what this material did and how it did, and to break the assumptions for herself. And so she was very much driven in that way.
A question that we got a little bit earlier was whether you could comment on Wallace Berman's Verifax collages in relation to DeFeo's collage and photographic practice.
DeFeo talked about Wallace Berman generally as one of her muses. They were very good friends. They had various interactions. She certainly knew about the Verifaxes. They had a visual artistic riff, kind of like a jazz. You play a note, I play a note with the Verifaxes. And of course, they're an early version of photocopy, which she did extensively, and we have a great body of that work. So I think Berman was important to her. We have portraits now at the Whitney. She did 4 portraits of Wallace Berman based on a photograph of himself that she sent. So I think there was a profound relationship between Wallace, his wife Shirley, and Jay. And they encouraged each other.
Yeah, yeah. I'm gonna leave us here with another photograph of Jay DeFeo this time, and wondering if you could speak a little bit too about her darkroom practice, where she may have learned how to develop photographs, and sort of how it was that she came to become so sort of involved with that process in the 70s.
As with everything in the studio, even when she went to school and got graduate and undergraduate degrees in art studio, she was self-taught because she was the experimenter. She was the one going outside. And when she was making jewelry in the 50s, she taught herself how to do that, and eventually really became a master jeweler for a short period of time. And the same thing was true with photography. She struggled making her own prints. And while she was teaching at the San Francisco Art Institute with a very noble history of the first photography department, she was one of the first professors that allowed the photography students into her painting classes. And in return, they took her into the photography studio and helped her to refine her studio practice. So in 1973, when she got an NEA, she used the money to buy a Hasselblad and to build a darkroom. And so it was her own process, and she progressed. She was, as always, very hard on herself. And she never editioned prints. She wasn't interested in the perfection of them. She was interested in the exploration and the literal development of making photographs as an artist.
And I think we've seen, tonight so much of how the camera and photo-based or photo-adjacent works are a kind of like red thread throughout so much of her practice from the mid-50s, and through the whole way through, really.
Exactly. That's true. The more we understand, the more we see. And also the more questions scholars and curators ask us, the more we dig and figure it out.
Yes, definitely. Well, thank you so much, Leah. That was wonderful.
This has been a pleasure.
Lovely to spend an evening with you and in Jay DeFeo's work.
I'd like to mention that Jay and Walter Hopps also had a very profound relationship. She considered him as, I think, the major advocate of her work for many years, and valued his input and his support tremendously. And it was because of that that she wanted After Image to come to the Menil when he was there. And so there's a history between DeFeo, Walter Hopps, and the Menil that's now being continued. Caroline Huber is on your board and on our advisory committee, and it just continues. And so that's something particularly wonderful, I think, about the collection and the relationship of DeFeo to the Menil.
Yes, and I'm so glad that this exhibition provided us with the sort of opportunity to really think through that relationship more, and that, and the sort of arc of her work in general more. That's going to be about the end of our talk.
It's been great planning this
with
with you, Natalie. Thank you.
Thank you. For our viewers, a selection of books on Jay DeFeo, catalogs, and other things are currently available at the Menil Collection bookstore, which you can email bookstore@menil.org for further information and list of those. Our next In Dialogue program will be next week on Wednesday, August 26th. It will be In Dialogue on Bryce Martin's drawings, and Kelly Montana will be joined by independent critic and curator Lily Way. So please tune in exactly 1 week for that. And just once again, thank you to everyone for joining us, and we look forward to seeing you soon. Thank you.